Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. Today is episode 18 of Azure Zero to Hero series, and in this video we will explore Azure DevOps interview questions. In the previous videos, I think from day 13 we started learning about Azure DevOps. We started with understanding the overview of Azure DevOps. What are the different services that are part of Azure DevOps? What each and every service does, such as what does Azure Repos does, what does Azure Boards does, artifacts, pipelines, we covered in day 13. Then in day 14, we learned how to implement continuous integration using the Azure pipelines. We took a multi microservice architecture application and we implemented the CI for that. Then in day 15, we implemented the continuous delivery for the same multi-microservice architectured application. And in today's video, we will cover the interview questions. All the questions that I'm going to cover are going to be scenario-based interview questions. So please try to watch it till the end. So if we have to start, you can go to the Day-18 folder. And in the Day-18 folder, there is this file called interview questions. So the questions and answers to the question are available here, but I will try to explain them in more elaborated way and probably how I would explain these things in an interview. So you can use this file as a reference or revision once you complete the video, but do not completely rely on this particular file. Let's get started with question number 1. Complete CI/CD pipeline process. So the question can be, how does the Azure DevOps CI/CD pipeline look in your organization? Or interviewers can also ask you, can you explain one of the CI/CD pipelines that you have implemented in your organization? So I will take this as a very good opportunity if someone asks me this question, because through this question, you can explain that you have good amount of knowledge on CI/CD, where interviewers will get convinced, because one of the critical part of DevOps engineering role is continuous integration and continuous delivery. So try to make the most out of this question. Start with explaining what exactly is the CI/CD process in your organization. For example, you can start with saying, so in our organization, we have, or I have implemented continuous integration and continuous delivery for a microservice project, microservice application. If you want, you can explain about the application. Otherwise, you can start explaining that the CI process is implemented using Azure Pipelines and CD process is implemented using DevOps, which I would prefer. Otherwise, you can talk about Ansible, shell scripts, Python, anything. But my priority would be GitOps. So I would start explaining this way, that I have implemented microservice CI/CD for a microservice architectured application where CI is implemented using Azure Pipelines and CD is implemented using GitOps. Now I'll start explaining the stages. So in order the pipeline to initiate, or the CI/CD process to initiate, so whenever a developer commits a code change, right? You can explain this same thing. Whenever developer commits a code change to our source code that is stored in Azure Repos or GitHub, both of them are good fit for the Azure ecosystem. So you can pick up any of these things. Whenever a developer commits a code change to the Azure Repos or GitHub, we have our Azure Pipelines, which is the CI, and the Azure Pipelines are stored in the same place where the source code repository or the source code is available. And this pipeline triggers multiple stages, such as stage 1, static code analysis and unit testing of the code change or the complete application. Stage 2 is to build where in the build process, the output of the build stage is a Docker image, because our application is a containerized application. So here the output is a Docker image. And then we will proceed forward scanning the image that is created, where here you can explain you are using something like Snake or Docker Scout, Trivy, Clear. There are a lot of options. So you can pick up any of these things. After that, probably one more stage can be to push the created Docker image to Artifactory. The best fit here is Azure Container Registry. And finally, the last stage of the CI should be an update script, right? Which updates the newly created image in the Kubernetes YAML manifest, right? Because once the new image is created, and if the new image is published to the ACR, the new image should be updated in your Kubernetes YAML manifest or Helm charts, whatever you are using. Then comes your CD process, where once the new image is updated in the Kubernetes or Helm YAML manifest, in CD, where you are using GitOps, let's say you are using Argo CD. So Argo CD picks up this new image and deploys it to the AKS cluster, which is a Azure Kubernetes cluster, or you can use any other Kubernetes cluster as well. So this is how I would explain the end-to-end CI/CD process. If you want, you can add more stages here as well. Example, you can add stages like SAST, you can add stages like DAST. If you have end-to-end testing, usually it's better to add a stage for end-to-end testing. People also call it as regression testing, or if you have anything like performance testing, whatever you want, you can add as part of the CI stages, but do not miss this primary stages. Then in the CD process, CD can only get triggered if you are using the GitOps approach. It get triggered when you update the YAML manifest in the repository where you have Kubernetes manifest. I can show you a very quick example if you haven't followed our previous videos, right, where we have implemented CI/CD for this particular application. If you look at this particular project, just go to the overview of it, repos. So this is the complete source code. And what we have done is we have implemented the pipelines. So this is 3 microservice architecture project where I've created Azure Pipeline for the results microservice, Azure Pipeline for the worker microservice, and also Azure Pipeline for the OAT microservice. If you go to the OAT microservice, you will find the stages such as build. In the build, we have created the Docker image. In the push, we have pushed the Docker image to ACR, that is Azure Container Registry. And finally, I have a stage called update, which updated this K8 specifications folder. Let's say there is a deployment file for OAT. So this CI pipeline in the last stage will update the image. Right now, the image tag is 65, right? When the new image is created, the update script will update the image tag to 66. As soon as this particular change is done, then the GitOps comes into picture and it deploys the new image with the YAML manifest, this particular YAML manifest, onto the AKS Kubernetes cluster. So this is how you have to explain the end-to-end CI/CD pipeline process. You can improvise it, you can bring your own version of it, but at least try to cover the things that I have explained. Okay, let's see what is question number 2. Securing sensitive information in pipelines. This is a concept, and the scenario-based question can be, you need to securely store API keys and other secrets used in the pipeline task. How do you ensure their protection while maintaining pipelines functionality? A lot of people talk about DevSecOps, so this is similar question on that lines. Basically, securing your CI/CD pipelines. In our case, the context is Azure DevOps. So let's try to understand. how can you secure API tokens or API keys? If you go to the project that we have implemented, like go to the Azure repos, if you have implemented the same project, otherwise, just see what I'm trying to show. So this is one of the Azure pipelines. And in this Azure Pipelines project, what I've done is I am using Azure Container Registry, where the pipelines push stage push the image that is created to the Azure Container Registry. And to push to the container registry, which is a private registry and repository, you need a API token or access key. In this particular project, I have stored it here, but while creating the project itself and while explaining, I've clearly mentioned this is not the right way to do it. Things work fine, but to make it secure, what you need to do is if you go to the pipeline section, so there is an option where click on the pipeline that you want. For example, the OAT service, click on the edit button and you have the variable section here. So you can create a variable and you can read that variable from the vault secret, right? So Azure has something called Azure Vault. So you can integrate, either you can use this variable section or you can integrate this Azure DevOps with the Azure Vault series service. Right now, in the Azure Zero to Hero course that I'm doing, we haven't covered the Azure Vault yet. We have Azure Vault video. Right now, it is not completed. So for now, just try to understand. So if someone asks you that question, not just in Azure pipelines, right? If anyone is asking you this kind of questions on any CI/CD tools like Jenkins or Azure Pipelines, GitHub Actions, so what you need to do is you need to mention that when it comes to the secrets, either you store them if you're talking about GitHub Actions, let's say. So there is something called environments in the pipeline where you have CI/CD variables for both GitHub Actions and GitLab. So you can say that you can store any kind of sensitive information such as passwords or API tokens, any sort of things in that particular location. Or the preferred one is go with Vault. You can use HashiCorp Vault, right? Even in Azure, you can use HashiCorp Vault. You can take a VM and install HashiCorp Vault on top of it. Or else Azure also has something called as Azure Vault, where you can store all your secrets in that vault and you can reference them there in your Azure pipelines. So this is how you can make your pipelines secure. And questions can be who can maintain this Azure Vault. So in your organization, who is maintaining the Azure Vault? So you can either mention that as a DevOps engineering team, you are doing it if you have experience with Azure Vault. If you don't have experience with Azure Vault, you can say that it is maintained by a security team or some other team where they own the vault, they store all the secure information in the vault, and they share you the reference to that, which you can use in your Azure pipelines. You can talk about both of these options. So that is our question number 2. Question number 3 is about integrating Azure Container Registry or any container registry in your pipelines. So the scenario based question can be, your application uses Docker containers. How would you integrate ACR with your Azure pipelines for building, pushing, and deploying container images? Because we are talking about Azure Container Registry, it's very simple. What you need to do is you can go to your pipelines and within the pipeline, you can create a stage, right? So the structure of Azure pipelines is that you have stages. Within the stages, you have multiple, like you have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And again, you have jobs and steps within that, right? So to connect to Azure Container Registry and to push an image, what you can do in your pipeline, if you go to this pipeline, so within the pipeline, you can create a new stage called push, just like I did. And here you can use the task called as docker@2 and command as push. So when you use the command as push, this entire thing gets generated like, let me quickly show you. If I click on this settings button, if you use the task as Docker 2, then here you get the options to provide the command. And if you provide the command as push, or if you provide the command as login, logout, depending upon the command that you have chosen, once you click on the add button, this entire code gets generated. Otherwise, this is the same thing every time. So you can also remember this thing. But the most important point of this entire question is, how do you sensitively store the API token to it? So you can use this particular thing called as container registry in the input section, and you can provide the connection between your Azure pipelines and the ACR using this connection token or the connection string. So you can store this connection string. So this gets created when you create the pipeline, and you can store this connection string within the Azure Vault, or you can also store it as part of the variables. So this is about question number 3. Question number 4, debugging pipeline failures. And the scenario can be, your pipeline consistently fails at a specific stage. How would you approach troubleshooting and identify the root cause of the issue? Which is a very, very common task, right? Even while I was explaining this entire thing, this CI/CD process, even I ran into the issues. If you watch the video, I did not even cut the video or trim the video. I put it as is because you can also watch the video and understand real-time troubleshooting. One of the issues that I ran into, probably you can talk about these issues in your interviews as well. So if you go to our pipelines, while I was implementing the CI/CD for the OAT service, there were a lot of failures. See here, the pipeline continuously failed, and it was failing on the stage called update kh manifest.sh. So what actually happened was, I wrote a shell script, right? If you go to the shell script, this stage shows as passed, but if you go to the output of the shell script, see, it was adding a very strange tag. Like I told you, this update script, it updates a particular image tag to the deployment.yaml. And here it was adding a very strange thing. And when the deployment stage is actually trying to deploy this particular artifact or the YAML manifest, it said bad indentation and it failed in the oat deployment.yaml. So the stage that is failing is the deployment stage, but why it is failing? So to troubleshoot that, when I went into the stages, I noticed that the Kubernetes deployment manifest file had wrong indentation or wrong YAML manifest syntax. And the reason for that was the previous stage, which was updating the shell script. So it was updating in the wrong way, where it is providing with a strange syntax. So I went to the shell script and I fixed the shell script. So you can answer these kind of questions only when you implement the pipelines. So this is one example that I've given, but while implementing the pipeline, even if you look at my case, I think I had to execute this particular pipeline somewhere close to 40 to 50 times to make sure the pipeline is running with complete CI/CD without any failures and it's consistent. To ensure that, even it took me like 40 to 50 runs. So every time there is a failure, and how did I understand the failure? To troubleshoot, I went to the pipeline, I went to the particular task or something that is failing. Then I can go to the logs of each stage. In this stage, I went to the logs of deployment, which is the stage that is failing. Then I realized the Kubernetes manifest is not updating with the right indentation. So I tried to look at the previous stage, that was shell script. It is passing, but it is the culprit which is creating the wrong indentation. Similarly, you might get some errors in the push stage. You might get some errors in the build stage. So you can explain about all of these things. Okay, let's move to the next question. Handling code merges and rollbacks in pipeline. So the scenario question can be, you discover a critical bug in the recently deployed production environment. How would you leverage Azure Pipelines for a rollback and ensure safe merging of the fix? So here, the question is a critical one, but the answer to it is very, very simple. I will try to explain the question first. So the interviewer is asking, let's say there is a production pipeline, or let's call it as release pipeline. Mostly production fixes goes from release branches that I have explained in the branching strategy video as well. Let's say there is a release branch, right? And there is a developer or admin who has pushed the changes to the release branch, and somehow the change passed through the CI/CD pipeline, right? The complete CI/CD pipeline that is on the release branch using the Azure Pipelines as CI with the multiple stages passed, and also the CD stage, the GitOps stage, deployed the new change onto the Kubernetes cluster. Somehow the person who has reviewed this change also did not catch the security or any critical fix on the production that this particular change has created. Now what happened is this change passed through the CI/CD pipeline. Let's say the change is that, for very simple understanding, don't take it too serious. Let's say that the functionality which was already there was it's a calculator application, let's assume, and this person has added, instead of two numbers, if the current logic was addition of two numbers, this person has added a new logic where instead of addition, so the feature was to enable addition of three numbers, but instead of addition, let's say this person has implemented a subtraction. So two numbers are getting added and the third number is getting subtracted. Very basic example so that everyone can understand. And this functionality went into it. And when the users got an information that, okay, now there is a new feature in the application that is addition of three numbers. So people started using it and they realized that the functionality is not working fine. How do you fix it? This is the question. So the rollback strategy is very, very simple, where if you have a proper CI/CD pipeline for your release pipeline, for your production pipeline, then you can go to this particular branch. Instead of developer, you can directly go to this particular branch and run the git revert command. So revert it to the previous stage where things were working fine, and immediately the entire CI/CD pipeline will trigger and it will push the previous stage, that is addition of two numbers. Let's say you don't want to revert and you want to fix it, right? When there is a critical production fix, there are often two things that developers and DevOps engineers does. Number one is to revert, or number two is to fix. So revert I have explained. If you want to fix, then it might take some time. The developers have to look at the complete change and developers will push a new change. And this new change will be addition of three numbers. And with this new change, the entire pipeline will be triggered and the addition functionality for three numbers will work fine. So the entire catch is in the CI/CD pipeline. You have to mention how do you do the revert, or if someone is asking you the question, how do you handle rollbacks? Then you need to mention that we have a CI/CD pipeline for the release branch. So either we go to the repository, we go to the release branch and execute the revert command, git revert command, or we will ask one of the developers to fix the change. And once the developers fix the change, the entire CI/CD pipeline is triggered and the issue is solved. So this is about handling rollbacks. Next question. Utilizing Azure Runners for self-hosted environments. The scenario-based question, your company has specific infrastructure requirements and needs to run pipeline on self-hosted machines. How would you leverage Azure Runners for this purpose? So the question is very simple, but it is tweaked in such a way that person who is answering this question gets confused. So The question is basically about, can you use self-hosted runners? And if you use the self-hosted runners, how to do it? In our case, when we were learning on a free Azure subscription. So we did not even had a chance. We had to go with the self-hosted runners only. But generally in Azure, there are two runners. One is Azure Runners, where you can rely on the Azure infrastructure. You don't have to manage your runners which are executing the CI/CD pipeline, right? To execute this entire CI/CD pipeline, you need a virtual machine or you need a container, right? Only on top of that, this task will run. So Azure provides two options. One is you can go with Azure Runners, where you don't have control to the virtual machine. Azure provides you that virtual machine. Or you can also use a self-hosted runner. In our case, we did this because in the free subscription, right now, Azure is not allowing the Azure runners. You have to submit a form and it's a lengthy process. So we went through the self-hosted runners. And how did we do it? It was very simple, right? So we went to the Azure, not on the Azure DevOps board, but we went to the Azure board, the Azure console, and we created a virtual machine there in a particular resource group and in a particular region. And then we go to the Azure DevOps, we go to the pipeline section, agent pools, and within the agent pool, you can add a new pool, right? And whenever you are executing your pipeline, so let's say we are executing the OAT service. So within the OAT service CI/CD YAML file, you have to mention that this particular repository should run on the pool called Azure Agent, which you have created on the Azure console. This is how you can create a self-hosted agent and use the particular agent using this syntax in your Azure pipelines. So that was the question. Question was tweaked in such a way that you get confused. Implementing role-based access control in the pipeline. Your team has various roles with different access needs. How do you configure RBAC with Azure pipelines to ensure users have appropriate permissions? This is a very, very generic question. So whenever you hear the term called RBAC, there is nothing to worry about it. It is simply role-based access control. And this system is available in every CI/CD pipeline process. Let's say you're talking about Jenkins, right? Even in Jenkins, when you have the Jenkins pipelines, your developers might only need permissions to run the Jenkins pipelines. Your QA team might not even run the Jenkins pipeline. They might just need the read permissions. Here we are talking about write permissions. Here we are talking about the read permissions for QA team. DevOps engineers, usually DevOps engineers are admins for the CI/CD. So they might have admin access. So this is exactly what you have to explain. When someone is asking you about the RBAC, just explain that we have implemented RBAC where developers get the right permissions to the CI pipelines. QA engineers might only have the read permissions. Managers also have the read permissions, and DevOps engineers have the admin permissions. For different CI systems, the implementation of RBAC is different, but this is how you have to explain. And by implementing this RBAC process, we ensure that only right people have access to the pipelines. Cool. Let's move to the next question. Automating infrastructure provision using pipelines. So here, the scenario-based question is that this is a very interesting question where interviewers just ask you, how do you manage Terraform or how do you manage infrastructure as code in your organization? Let's say the organization which you are giving interview, they are using ARM templates, or let's say they are using Terraform, right? Or let's say they are using any other thing. It can be AWS. So the question can be, how do you handle infrastructure, or it can be the bicep templates as well. How do you handle infrastructure as code in your organization? So if you say that Terraform scripts are stored in a virtual machine, and we execute that Terraform scripts on a virtual machine, then you are not working in a team. So how you have to explain, just like we have the CI/CD in place for the source code. Let's say you have a Java application source code. We have written this entire CI/CD pipeline, right? Similarly, you have to mention that we are using Terraform or we are using ARM through CI/CD pipelines. And this CI/CD pipelines, we call them as infrastructure pipelines. So if anyone wants to implement a infrastructural change, they have to go to the Git repository where the Terraform code or ARM code is available. Just like how the source code for this particular OAT service is available in the Azure repos. Similarly, you will also place the source code for the Terraform scripts in the Azure repository, and you will create a pipeline for the Terraform scripts where the stages might not be similar. You just need the run stage probably, or you just need Terraform init and Terraform apply stage. So you just have two stages maybe, but everything will go through a CI/CD pipeline so that you have a proper track of who is making which changes. So that is how you have to explain. If someone asks you about the infrastructure, how do you automate and how do you manage the infrastructure? Maintaining pipeline security throughout the CI/CD process. I kept this question intentionally towards the end because a lot of people are asking about DevSecOps. So I thought, let me clearly talk about it. So DevSecOps is nothing but implementing DevOps with security best practices. And this is part of each and every tools and technology that you are using as a DevOps engineer. For example, whenever you are using Kubernetes, security should be on top of your mind. When you are using CI/CD, security should be on top of your mind. When you are using Terraform, security should be on top of your mind. Ansible, whatever you are doing. So DevSecOps, it's not actually a role or a designation, but as a DevOps engineer, you have to consider security in place. Previously, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there used to be dedicated team for security, but right now, developers have to think about security, DevOps engineers have to think about security, everyone have to think about security. So that's why DevSecOps is part of DevOps engineering role itself. In today's video, because we are talking about Azure DevOps, the question is that how do you maintain security for your CI/CD pipelines? So what you need to answer this question, exactly how I have explained the CI/CD process, right? But in each of the stages, how do you maintain the security? For example, in the build stage, you can mention that as part of the build stage, we run the static code analysis. Then you have the image creation stage. So in the image creation stage, you can mention we are using Docker Scout, or we are using Trivy, you are using any particular security scanning tool. In the image push stage, let's say in our case, we are using ACR. Within ACR, once you push the image, there are vulnerability scanning tools within the ACR. You just have to enable it. Or let's say you are pushing to Quay. Within Quay, there is an option. Once you check the box, you can continuously verify vulnerabilities on the image. Then you have the Kubernetes or the deployment stage. Again, within the deployment, how do you deploy? How do you store the tokens? How do you store the access keys? This is what you have to explain if someone is asking about the security part of the CI/CD pipeline. I will add more things towards the interview questions. Don't worry. Right now, there are only 9 questions. But whenever I come across these scenario-based questions, I'll keep updating that on the repository. Thank you so much for watching the video. See you all in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.